You ever get totally sucked into something, like you're going down this rabbit hole of information? That's been me with psychotherapy lately. I'm trying to figure out what makes it tick, what really helps people change.
Yeah, it's a fascinating field for sure.
And the deeper I dive, the more this whole Therapeutic Alliance thing keeps coming up.
It's definitely a recurring theme in the research, like this golden thread that connects to better outcomes no matter what type of therapy you're looking at.
Right. It's like that connection, that bond, it almost overshadows the specifics of the therapy itself. But then the question becomes, what is it about that relationship that makes such a difference? Is it really the magic sauce everyone says it is?
Well, that's what we're here to unpack, right?
Exactly. And luckily, we've got a mountain of research to dig through.
We've got those classic studies that really laid the groundwork,
Oh, and some brand new findings, too.
hot off the presses.
So one of the things I find interesting is how many different ways researchers try to measure this alliance thing.
A bit slippery, isn't it?
Yeah, like trying to define jazz, and you know it when you hear it, but explaining it is a whole other story.
Right.
Some researchers are all about whether the therapist and client agree on goals, which makes sense, especially in something like CBT, right? But then you've got others who are way more focused on the emotional bond, the trust, the feeling, understood, very humanistic.
And it's really interesting to go back to the roots of all this. Even before all these sophisticated ways of measuring the alliance came about, the early psychoanalysts were already emphasizing how important it was. They saw it as fundamental for being able to get to those deeper issues, those unconscious patterns that might be causing someone distress.
So it's like, without that alliance, you can't really dig into the good stuff.
Exactly. And to really understand it, there's this important distinction made by Greenson back in '65. He talked about two sides of this alliance coin, the working alliance and the therapeutic alliance.
Okay, I'm intrigued. Break that down for me.
So picture this. The working alliance, that's all about the nuts and bolts of therapy, collaborating on goals, working through those tasks.
Makes sense.
The therapeutic alliance, that's about the personal bond, the feeling of trust and being understood. Think of it like this. You've got a client coming in for help with, say, panic attacks. The working alliance, that might be about creating a plan to track triggers, maybe practice some relaxation techniques. But let's say this client, they've also got this deep-seated fear of disappointing people. Maybe it stems from a critical parent. That's where the therapeutic alliance comes in, allowing them to explore that fear, to feel safe enough to be vulnerable.
Because if they don't feel safe, they're not going to open up, right?
Exactly. And what's fascinating is that these two aspects of the alliance, the working and the therapeutic, they can work beautifully together, but sometimes they can clash, It can get a little messy.
That's a really helpful way to think about it. And it makes me wonder about all the other things that we often hear are important in therapy. Like a client's expectations, their attachment style, whether they click with their therapist and find them empathetic.
Right, right.
Do those things have their own separate impact, or does a strong alliance kind of just make them irrelevant?
Ah, the million-dollar question. Well, there's this fantastic meta-analysis from 2017 by Soto and their team.
Okay, hit me with it.
They crunched a ton of data, and what they did was control for all those factors, expectations, attachment, empathy, and even after accounting for all of that, the alliance was still the strongest predictor of good outcomes.
So it's not just a happy accident when other things are going well. It's powerful on its own.
Exactly. But wait, there's more. While the alliance was this clear frontrunner, here's the thing. Therapist empathy still mattered, even after they accounted for how strong the alliance was. It was like this little whisper in the data.
Okay, now my brain is doing loops. So the alliance is this big deal, but empathy still matters. I thought a good alliance meant you had empathy covered.
That's a head scratcher, right? Maybe the alliance is more of this umbrella term, encompassing empathy, but also going beyond it. Like, it's about how well the therapist and client collaborate, how clear their communication is, even how they handle those inevitable bumps in the road that happen in any relationship, therapy included. And, it makes you wonder, if empathy is this important factor, but maybe not the whole story, what else is going on with this powerful alliance?
Well, there's this amazing study we need to talk about by Flickiger and their team, published back in 2018. It's a meta-analysis.
Okay, love a good meta-analysis. More data, more insights.
Exactly. And this one was huge. I'm talking over 30,000 patients, almost 300 studies, and they looked at therapy happening everywhere, face-to-face, online, you name it.
Wow, that's impressive. And did this whole alliance effect hold up even with all that data? It totally did. No matter who was rating the alliance, the client, the therapist, Even those independent observers, that link between a strong alliance and positive outcomes was super clear. Didn't matter what kind of therapy they were doing, how severe the client's issues were, or even what country they were in.
So it's pretty universal then. This bond, this alliance, it's a big deal across the board. But I do have to ask, with all this emphasis on the alliance, are we missing something? Like, are there other things that are critical for therapy to be successful, or is it really all about the alliance?
That's a really important question to consider, right? And Flickiger's team, they actually dug into that. They wanted to know if maybe this alliance thing was just a side effect of something else.
Like what?
Well, for example, what if people who come in with really severe problems, what if they just have a harder time forming that strong alliance in the first place? Wouldn't that make it seem like the alliance is the driving force when it's really reflecting something else?
Yeah, if you're already feeling overwhelmed, it's going to be tough to build trust, right?
Exactly. So Flickiger's team, they got really fancy with their analysis. They statistically controlled for how severe someone's symptoms were when they started therapy and even how much they improved in those first few sessions.
Okay, so they took all of that out of the equation. What happened?
Even then, the alliance was still a strong predictor of how things turned out down the road. It wasn't just a fluke, a reflection of how much someone was struggling or not.
So they proved that it's not just a coincidence. The alliance really does make a difference.
It really seems that way. And, this gets to that thorny issue of causation. We can't ever say for sure that one thing causes another in these complex human endeavors, right?
Right.
But the evidence from Flickiger's meta-analysis, it's pretty convincing. A strong alliance, it doesn't just magically appear because someone's doing well. It seems way more likely that it's an active ingredient in creating positive change.
But this is pretty mind-blowing stuff.
Yeah.
So if we're saying that the alliance is this vital active ingredient, what does that mean for someone listening right now? How do we take this research and turn it into something practical, something that helps people in the real world of therapy?
That's the million-dollar question, right? Because it's one thing to know something's important, it's another to actually make it happen. But the good news is the research gives us some clues. And thankfully, it's not about being perfect or having this idyllic therapist-client relationship that never hits a snag. Remember those ruptures we talked about?
Those inevitable bumps in the road.
Exactly. Even the strongest alliances will have moments of disagreement, tension. It's how you navigate those moments that matters.
So it's not about avoiding conflict, but about using it to make the connection stronger.
Yes, 100%. So where do we even start? Well, Flickiger's study and some of the other research we've looked at, it points to a few key things that seem to really make a difference. And one of the most basic, yet often overlooked, is simply being crystal clear about the goals of therapy.
That seems pretty obvious. Why wouldn't you be on the same page about that?
You'd be surprised. It's easy to make assumptions, right?
Right.
But if you don't know where you're going, how will you know if you're even on the right path?
It's like that saying, if you don't know where you're going, any road will get you there. But in therapy, it's more like, if you don't know what you're working toward, how will you know if you're even making progress?
Exactly. And remember that study we talked about earlier about how clients and therapists might see the alliance differently? What the therapist thinks is a successful outcome might not be the same as what the client is hoping for.
That makes total sense.
So making sure everyone's on the same page about the destination, that's crucial.
So it's not just about having goals, but making sure they're shared, right?
Yes. And that leads us to another key ingredient, communication. Flickiger found it wasn't enough to just agree on the what of therapy, the goals. You've also got to be on the same page about the how.
The process.
Yes. How are we going to reach those goals? What's the journey going to look like?
It's like building a house together. You wouldn't want the contractor to just start randomly laying bricks without checking the blueprints. You'd want to talk about the design, the materials, the timeline. Right. It's a collaboration.
That is such a great analogy. And just like building that house, that clear, open communication, it's essential for a strong alliance. It's about feeling heard, understood, respected, all throughout the process.
It's amazing how a simple analogy can really drive things home.
Yeah.
Right? That whole house building metaphor, it just clicks.
Yeah.
It makes total sense why that kind of communication is so important for a good therapeutic relationship.
Right. It shows you how important that collaboration is. And speaking of things clicking, another thing that comes up in the research is that sense of trust, that feeling of safety in the therapeutic space.
Yeah, because if you don't feel safe, you're not going to open up.
Right.
You're not going to talk about the hard stuff.
Right.
And if you're not being vulnerable, how are you supposed to make progress?
Exactly. And it's not just about feeling comfortable with your therapist on a personal level, it's deeper than that. It's about trusting their expertise, knowing they can handle what you share, and that they won't judge you.
It's funny, it makes me think of that Brene Brown quote: vulnerability is not weakness, it's our greatest measure of courage. But you're only going to be courageous if you feel safe.
100%. And that brings us back to empathy. Remember how it kept popping up in the research, even when the alliance was already strong? It's that ability of the therapist to really get you where you're coming from, not just intellectually, but emotionally too. And that lays the groundwork for real change to happen.
It's like in one of the sources we looked at, the importance of the Therapeutic Alliance.
Yeah.
It has the interesting exercise. It was all about reflecting on your different relationships and how the needs they meet are different. Like what you need from a best friend versus your boss. Totally different, right?
Oh, absolutely.
Different relationships, different ways of being.
And those needs, they shape how we are in those relationships. Like, if you're looking for advice from your best friend and they just keep changing the subject, that's frustrating. But if your boss starts giving you unsolicited life advice, that's way out of bounds.
Context is everything. And so with the Therapeutic Alliance, it's like its own special type of relationship, right? Its own set of needs and expectations.
Yes. And just like any important relationship, you have to talk about those needs, nurture them, tend to them.
I love that. It really highlights that it's not just a formula, this therapy thing. It's a dance.
Yeah.
It's messy, and it unfolds over time.
And like any good dance, it takes two.
That's so true. So we've been focusing a lot on the therapist's role in building the alliance, but what about the client? If you're the one seeking therapy, what can you do to help build a good, strong, healthy relationship with your therapist?
Such a good question. It really emphasizes that collaborative spirit we keep coming back to. Because the client isn't just along for the ride, right? They have an active role to play. One of the biggest things is showing up authentically, being honest, even when it's tough.
It makes me think of that saying, the truth will set you free, but first it will piss you off. And
Yeah.
sometimes therapy's like that, right?
Yeah.
You have to work through those uncomfortable truths to get to the good stuff.
It can be like that, yeah. But that's what the therapist is there for, to hold space for it all, the messiness, the vulnerability, without judgment. And, if something doesn't feel right, if you're feeling misunderstood or like the therapy isn't working, speak up.
Use your voice.
Exactly. Remember that study about how clients, they really care about whether therapy feels helpful, productive?
Yeah.
If it's not, that's so important to share with your therapist. It might be a little awkward at first, but a therapist who really values that alliance, they'll welcome that feedback. They'll see it as a chance to get back on track.
So those ruptures, those times when it feels a little rocky, they can actually be good for the relationship.
Absolutely. It's about being able to say, hey, this isn't working, and then figuring out together why and what to do differently. And sometimes that might mean realizing that it's just not the right fit and it's time to find a different therapist, and that's okay.
Yeah, it really is. It's like dating. Not every therapist is going to be the right fit. Just like not every first date turns into something more. Sometimes you got to go on a few therapy dates to find the person who feels right.
That's a great way to put it. It's about finding that therapist with whom you feel comfortable being vulnerable, who you can trust to be there with you when things get tough, and who really sees and hears you.
Someone who gets you and your house blueprints.
Exactly. And celebrates the wins and holds your hand through the challenges. It's a special kind of relationship.
It really is.
Yeah.
Well, as we wrap up our deep dives into the Therapeutic Alliance, it seems like the biggest thing we've learned is that this connection, it's not just some bonus, it's essential.
It really is. And, while we're still figuring out exactly how to cultivate it every time, the research gives us some pretty strong hints. We're talking clear communication, shared goals, feeling safe to be yourself, and that willingness to be vulnerable on everyone's part.
It's about remembering that at the heart of it, therapy is a human connection. And just like any good relationship, you have to put in the effort, you have to talk to each other, and you have to show up authentically, even when it's not easy.
So to anyone listening, if you're thinking about therapy or you're already going, remember you have a voice. Ask questions. Talk about what you're experiencing. Don't be afraid to stand up for your own healing.
Because at the end of the day, that's what it's all about.
Yeah.
Having the power to create the change you want in your life. Thanks for joining us for another deep dive. See you next time.